Emma wiped her hands on her apron as the smell of coffee and fresh pancakes filled the tiny diner. The morning rush was just beginning, and she was already exhausted. She had been working since 6 a.m., smiling at every customer who came in, no matter how tired she felt. Her feet ached, her back hurt, but she never complained. To her, every tip, every extra shift, meant she could pay for her mother's medicines and keep the lights on for another month. Life wasn't easy, but Emma had learned to live with little and dream quietly. She lived with her mother, a kind woman who had fallen sick years ago. The doctors said she needed expensive treatment, but Emma simply couldn't afford it. Her mother often told her not to worry, that everything would work out somehow, but Emma knew she was the only one holding their small world together. Every day, she promised herself that she would do whatever it took to make things better. Her father had disappeared when she was just a little girl. She remembered him faintly, his warm laugh, the way he carried her on his shoulders, and how he'd always tell her, "No matter how dark life gets, never stop being kind." Then one day he was gone. Her mother said he had left for work and never came back. The police found no trace of him, no explanation. Over time, people whispered that he might have abandoned them, but Emma never believed it. She felt deep in her heart that something had happened to him. Something unfair, something hidden. Now, all she had of him was a torn photograph she kept in her wallet. It showed her father standing proudly next to another man in front of a small office building. The photo was old, the edges faded, but she carried it everywhere. Sometimes on quiet nights after long shifts, she would take it out and whisper, "I miss you, Dad." At the diner, Emma was known as the Sunshine Girl. No matter how rude or impatient a customer was, she always managed to stay calm and kind. The regulars adored her, often leaving her little notes or chocolates. But behind her smile, she carried a deep loneliness, the kind that never really went away. She worked 2 jobs, barely slept, and skipped meals just to save money. Her dreams of going to college or traveling were long gone. All that mattered now was survival. That Friday morning, as she brewed another pot of coffee, her best friend and coworker, Lily, leaned over and said, "Emma, you really need a break. You've been working non-stop for weeks." Emma smiled weakly and said, "Maybe next month. Rent's due, and Mom's medicine just got more expensive." Lily sighed. She admired Emma's strength but worried about her constantly. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Businessmen rushing to offices, cars honking, people shouting. Inside the diner, life moved slower. Old men read newspapers at the counter. A group of construction workers joked loudly in a corner, and a mother tried to calm her crying baby near the window. It was a small world, but it was Emma's world. Predictable, safe, and full of stories. Yet, deep inside, she often wondered what her life could have been if her father were still around. She imagined him walking into the diner one day, smiling at her with proud eyes, saying, "You've grown so much, my little girl." That thought always brought tears to her eyes, but she would quickly wipe them away before anyone noticed. As the day went on, the diner grew busier. Emma carried trays of hot plates, refilled coffee cups, and greeted every new customer with her usual bright smile. Even when her manager scolded her for being slow or a customer snapped at her for a wrong order, she never let her kindness fade. People often underestimated her because of her simple clothes and tired face, but she had a quiet strength that no one could take away. When the lunch rush finally ended, Emma sat by the kitchen door for a few minutes, rubbing her sore feet. She took out her phone to check messages, none from anyone important. Just bills, reminders, and discount offers. She sighed and pulled out her wallet, looking at her father's picture again. "I wish you were here," she whispered. "Maybe things would be different." Her manager called her name, and she quickly slipped the photo back inside before anyone could see. That picture was her secret comfort, something she didn't want to explain. To her, it was more than a memory, it was hope. That evening, after closing the diner, Emma walked home through the chilly streets. The city lights reflected off the puddles on the sidewalk, and the cold wind brushed against her cheeks. She tightened her scarf and thought about her mother waiting at home, probably sitting by the window, knitting something for her. She smiled at the thought. No matter how hard life got, her mother always found small ways to make things feel warm. When Emma reached their tiny apartment, she found her mother asleep on the couch, an unfinished scarf resting on her lap. The TV flickered softly in the background. Emma covered her mother with a blanket, sat beside her, and whispered, "I'll make things better, Mom. I promise." She looked at her father's photo once more and silently made a vow. One day, she would find out the truth about what happened to him. As she lay in bed that night, the sound of distant traffic mixed with her thoughts. She didn't know that fate was already moving quietly around her, preparing to bring her face to face with a man who held the answers she had been searching for all her life. A man whose name would soon change everything she believed about her father's disappearance. And while she drifted to sleep, unaware of what awaited her, the world outside continued its rhythm. Ordinary to everyone else, but about to become extraordinary for her. It was a quiet afternoon at the diner. The usual noise of clinking cups and the soft hum of the radio filled the air. Emma was busy cleaning the counter, lost in her thoughts, when she suddenly heard the sound of expensive shoes clicking against the tiled floor. The door opened, and for a moment, everyone in the diner turned their heads to look. A tall man in a dark gray suit walked in, confident, elegant, and clearly someone who didn't belong in a small, simple place like this. Emma looked up and froze for a second. She had seen men in suits before, but this one was different. There was something powerful about the way he carried himself, as if he owned every room he walked into. His expression was serious, his eyes sharp, and even though he didn't speak, everyone seemed to fall silent as he entered. The man took off his sunglasses and glanced around the diner with an uninterested look before choosing a corner booth. Whispers began to spread quietly among the customers. "Isn't that Richard Hale?" someone said. "The billionaire CEO?" another whispered. Emma didn't know much about him, but the name sounded familiar. She remembered reading about him in a newspaper once. One of the richest men in the country, known for his cold attitude and iron-like discipline in business. They said he never smiled, never trusted anyone, and had built his empire from the ground up. Emma didn't feel nervous, though. To her, he was just another customer who deserved the same polite service as anyone else. She picked up her notepad, straightened her apron, and walked over with her usual warm smile. "Good afternoon, sir. What can I get for you today?" she asked gently. Richard looked up at her, clearly surprised by how calm and kind she sounded. Most people he met either feared him or tried too hard to impress him. But this young waitress spoke to him like he was an ordinary man. He nodded slowly. "Just coffee." "Black," he said, his voice deep and steady. Emma smiled. "Of course, sir. I'll bring it right away." She turned and walked back to the counter, unaware that Richard was still watching her. There was something oddly familiar about her face, her eyes, the shape of her smile. It stirred a memory buried deep in his mind, but he couldn't quite place it. As Emma poured the coffee, she noticed through the reflection on the glass window that Richard was still looking in her direction. It made her slightly nervous, but she brushed it off. Maybe he was just bored or thinking about his work. She brought the cup over to him and placed it gently on the table. "Here you go. Be careful, it's hot," she said kindly. "Thank you," Richard replied, his tone polite but distant. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Emma could feel his eyes studying her again as she turned to leave. For some reason, she felt a strange pull, as if she had seen him before. But she quickly shook off the thought. How could she possibly know a billionaire like him? The diner slowly returned to normal. Customers started chatting again, and the soft music filled the air. Richard sipped his coffee, glancing occasionally at the people around him. He wasn't used to such places. Usually, he ate in expensive restaurants or private clubs. But today, he had wanted something different. Something quiet, away from flashing cameras and formal meetings. He didn't know what brought him there exactly, but something inside him had pushed him to stop at this small diner. As he sat there, his phone buzzed with messages. His assistant kept reminding him about an upcoming meeting, but he ignored it. For once, he didn't want to think about business. He He found himself listening to the sound of Emma's laughter as she chatted with a regular customer. There was warmth in her voice, something genuine that he rarely encountered in his world of money and lies. When Emma returned to check on him, she noticed he hadn't touched his food. "Is everything okay, sir? Would you like me to get you something else?" she asked softly. Richard shook his head. "No, it's fine. I just don't usually come to places like this." Emma smiled kindly. "Well, maybe that's a good thing. Sometimes it's nice to step away from the big world and enjoy something simple." Her words made him pause. He wasn't used to people talking to him like that, with honesty, not fear. He nodded slowly, a small hint of respect forming in his eyes. "You've worked here long?" he asked suddenly, surprising even himself. Emma nodded. "Almost 3 years now. It's not easy, but I like the people here. Feels like home." Richard studied her for a moment. There was a quiet strength in her voice. Not pride, but dignity. It reminded him of someone, but he couldn't remember who. He frowned slightly, lost in thought, as Emma walked away to serve another table. Outside, the sky had turned gray, and a light drizzle began to fall. The sound of rain tapping against the window created a peaceful rhythm inside the diner. Richard looked out at the street, thinking about his own life. For years he had chased money, success, and control. But sitting there, watching the humble waitress move gracefully between tables, he felt something strange. A sense of emptiness he had never noticed before. Emma glanced at him again from behind the counter. She couldn't explain it, but something about him felt heavy, like he carried a burden too big for one person. She wondered what kind of life a billionaire lived. Did he have a family? Did he ever feel lonely? As the afternoon went on, the diner grew quieter. Richard finished his coffee and stood up to leave. He placed a generous tip on the table, far more than the bill, and gave her a polite nod. "Thank you for the service," he said. Emma smiled warmly. "You're always welcome here, sir." He hesitated for a moment before walking out. The door closed softly behind him, and his expensive car disappeared into the rainy street. Emma watched through the window until the taillights faded. For some reason, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Something about the way he had looked at her. Not like a stranger, but like someone searching for a memory, lingered in her mind. She didn't know that this brief meeting was just the beginning of something much bigger. The man who had quietly entered her diner that afternoon would soon change her entire life, uncovering secrets buried deep in the past. Secrets that would connect their lives in ways neither of them could imagine. The next morning, the diner looked almost the same as always. The smell of toast, the clinking of plates, and the soft chatter of regular customers. But to Emma, something felt different. She couldn't stop thinking about the man from yesterday, the billionaire with the cold eyes and calm voice. She didn't know why he stayed in her mind. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, like he was trying to remember something. Or maybe it was just curiosity. People like him didn't visit small diners like hers very often. When she arrived at work, Lily nudged her playfully and said, "Guess what? That rich guy from yesterday, he's back." Emma's eyes widened in surprise. She quickly turned to look, and sure enough, there he was again, Richard Hale, sitting in the same corner booth, wearing another expensive suit, looking perfectly out of place among the cracked tiles and old furniture. Emma's heart beat a little faster. She didn't know why she felt nervous, but she quickly fixed her apron and walked over. "Good morning, sir. Coffee again?" she asked with her usual polite smile. Richard looked up at her, and for a moment he didn't answer. He just stared at her face. Her brown eyes, her gentle smile, the way her hair framed her cheeks. Something about her features made his chest tighten, as if a long-forgotten memory was trying to surface. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, black coffee, please." As she poured his drink, she couldn't help but notice how serious he looked. His eyes seemed distant, full of thoughts. She placed the cup on the table and said softly, "You look like you've had a long night." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "You could say that," he replied. Emma smiled kindly. "Coffee helps. At least, that's what keeps me going." For the first time, a small, almost invisible smile appeared on his face. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. When Emma walked away, Richard found himself watching her again. He didn't usually pay attention to strangers, but something about her made him uneasy and strangely emotional. Her face looked familiar in a way that was painful to remember. The more he tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling grew. He tried to focus on his phone, scrolling through messages from his office. His assistant had sent him a dozen reminders about meetings, but his mind wasn't in business mode. Every few minutes, his eyes wandered back to Emma. The way she moved, her kindness with customers, even the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. It all felt familiar, almost haunting. Meanwhile, Emma also found herself glancing toward his table. There was something about his eyes, a heaviness she couldn't explain. She wondered what kind of life a man like him lived. Did he ever feel lonely? Did he have anyone waiting for him at home? As she delivered a tray to another table, she overheard two customers whispering, "That's Richard Hale, right? The CEO of Hale Enterprises? They say he's one of the richest men in the country." Emma didn't care much for gossip, but the name Hale rang in her mind like a bell. It felt familiar, though she couldn't figure out why. When she came back to refill his cup, she noticed him looking at an old photo frame on the diner's wall. It showed the diner's grand opening years ago. "That picture's been there forever," she said, smiling. "That was the original owner. He and my dad used to come here together before I was born." Richard looked up sharply. "Your father?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said, surprised by his sudden interest. "He worked in business back then, but he's been gone a long time." Something flickered in Richard's eyes. Recognition? Shock? Maybe even guilt. He leaned back slowly. "What was his name?" "Daniel Brooks," she said softly. "You probably wouldn't know him." The cup in Richard's hand trembled slightly. He set it down carefully to hide it, forcing a calm expression. But inside, his mind was spinning. Daniel Brooks. That name, he hadn't heard it in years. It was a name buried deep in his past. A name tied to mistakes and painful memories he had tried to forget. He remembered Daniel, his father's old business partner, the man who vanished after a terrible deal went wrong. For years, Richard had been told Daniel had run away after betraying the company. But hearing his name now from this young waitress made him feel uneasy. He looked at her again. Really looked. Her eyes, they had Daniel's warmth. Her voice, it carried that same gentle tone he remembered from his father's stories. Could it be possible? Could this young woman be his daughter? "Daniel Brooks?" he repeated under his breath, almost as if testing the sound of it. Emma tilted her head slightly. "You knew him?" she asked. Richard hesitated. He didn't know what to say. "I think I might have heard that name once," he replied, trying to stay calm. Emma smiled faintly. "He was a good man," she said. "At least, that's what my mom always told me." Her words hit Richard like a wave. A good man. That wasn't what his father had told him. His father had painted Daniel as a liar, a traitor who nearly destroyed the family business. But now, looking into Emma's honest eyes, Richard wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe there was more to the story than he had been told. As the day went on, Richard stayed longer than usual. He ordered lunch, something he never did in small diners. He watched Emma move around, helping everyone with a genuine smile. He noticed how hard she worked, how she carried herself with quiet dignity despite her tiredness. Emma, too, began to feel more curious about him. Something in his eyes felt wounded, like he was carrying secrets. Every time she walked by, she felt that same strange connection grow stronger. When he finally stood up to leave, Emma smiled politely. "Thank you for visiting again, sir." Richard looked at her for a long moment before replying. "Thank you, Miss Brooks." His voice was softer this time, almost thoughtful. After he left, Emma stared at the door, feeling confused. There was something about the way he said her name, like it meant more to him than she realized. She didn't know that at that very moment, Richard was sitting in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his heart pounding. The name Daniel Brooks echoed in his mind again and again. If Emma was really Daniel's daughter, then everything he believed about his past and his family's business might have been built on a terrible lie. That night, as Emma cleaned the tables and closed the diner, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had just changed. Somewhere deep inside, she felt that the man who had quietly walked into her life was somehow connected to the mystery of her father's disappearance. She just didn't know how close she was to the truth, or how much that truth would shake both of their lives forever. The next few days passed quietly, but Emma couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Hale. Every time the diner door opened, she caught herself looking up, hoping it was him again. She didn't know why his presence had affected her so much. Maybe it was because of the strange connection she felt when he looked at her, or maybe it was the way he said her name, softly, almost with emotion. She had met thousands of customers, but no one had ever left her feeling this way. One cloudy afternoon, while Emma was taking orders, the door opened again, and there he was. Richard Hale walked in, dressed in a simple navy suit this time, no tie, no bodyguards. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a tired man who just wanted peace. Emma quickly finished serving another table and walked up to him with a smile. "Back again, sir?" she asked kindly. He nodded with a faint smile. "I suppose I am. Seems your coffee is better than what my office serves." Emma laughed lightly. "I'll take that as a compliment." She brought him his usual coffee and a slice of pie, which he didn't order but she decided to offer anyway. "On the house," she said cheerfully. "You look like you need something sweet today." Richard looked at the plate for a moment, then at her. "You shouldn't give things away for free," he said, though his tone was gentle. "Some things are worth more than money," she replied simply and walked away. Her words lingered in his mind. Some things are worth more than money. He repeated them silently as he stared at the steaming cup in front of him. He had spent his whole life chasing wealth, power, and status, but when was the last time he felt peace? Maybe never. As Emma worked, her old wallet fell out of her apron pocket and hit the floor. The sound caught Richard's attention. Emma quickly bent down to pick it up, but a small, worn-out photograph slipped out and fluttered across the floor, stopping right beside Richard's shoe. He leaned down automatically, picking it up before she could reach it. The edges were frayed, and the image had faded from years of being folded and carried around. Richard looked at it, and in that single moment his whole world stopped. It was a photograph of two men standing side by side in front of a small office building. One of them was his younger self, barely in his 20s, smiling proudly. And beside him stood Daniel Brooks, the man his father had once called a traitor, the man who had vanished after their business fell apart. His heart began to race. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the picture. The air around him seemed to disappear. He hadn't seen that photo in more than 20 years, but he remembered it vividly. It had been taken the day they signed their first big deal together. A day that was supposed to mark the beginning of a lifelong partnership. But that partnership had ended in tragedy and betrayal, or at least that's what he had been told. Emma reached for the photo, not realizing his shock. "Oh, that's mine," she said quickly, her cheeks turning red. "It's just an old picture of my dad. I keep it for luck." Richard's voice came out hoarse. You're your dad." He turned the photo slightly toward her. "That man beside me is your father?" Emma blinked in surprise, not understanding at first. "Wait, you knew him?" she asked softly. Richard didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the picture, memories flooding back. Daniel's laughter, his honesty, his loyalty. They had started everything together, built dreams side by side. Until the day Daniel disappeared, and Richard's father told him never to mention his name again. He finally looked up at Emma, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said quietly. "I knew him. A long time ago." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She sat down across from him, forgetting she was at work. "You knew my dad? What happened to him? Do you know where he went?" she asked eagerly, her eyes shining with hope. Richard opened his mouth to answer, but his throat tightened. How could he tell her that her father's name had been buried under lies? That his own family had played a part in destroying the man she loved and missed so much? I thought he left," Richard said finally, his voice trembling slightly. "Everyone believed he ran away after some Business problems. Emma shook her head quickly. No. My mother told me he was betrayed. She never believed he ran away. He would never leave us like that. Her words pierced through Richard like a knife. Betrayed. That was the word his father had forbidden him to use. But deep inside, something began to make sense. His father's sudden wealth after Daniel's disappearance. The missing files. The guilt his father carried in his final years but never explained. Could it all have been built on a lie? Richard's face grew pale. He looked down at the photo again. His younger self smiling next to a man who had trusted him like a brother. A man whose family now lived in poverty, while he had become a billionaire. The truth that had been buried for decades began to claw its way back to the surface. Emma noticed his silence and confusion. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. He looked up, forcing a weak smile. "I'm fine. It's just strange to see a face from the past." She nodded, not realizing the storm inside him. "I wish I knew what really happened," she said softly. "My mom still waits for answers. Sometimes, she even thinks he might come back one day." Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her everything. That he had known her father. That there were secrets she deserved to know. But his voice refused to form the words. "Maybe one day you'll get those answers," he said quietly. Emma smiled sadly. "I hope so." She took the photo back carefully and slipped it into her wallet again. As she walked away, Richard stayed frozen in his seat, staring into his coffee cup as guilt and realization washed over him. The photograph felt like a ghost from the past, reminding him of a man whose life had been destroyed, perhaps unjustly. And now, fate had brought him face to face with that man's daughter. When he finally stood to leave, he placed a few bills on the table, far more than the cost of his meal. But money meant nothing at that moment. His hands still shook as he opened the door. Outside, the cold wind hit his face, but he barely felt it. The city blurred around him. His mind was trapped in the past, in the memory of Daniel Brooks and the day everything went wrong. For the first time in years, the powerful billionaire felt small, human, and afraid. He looked back through the diner window one last time, watching Emma laugh with a customer. A lump formed in his throat. She had no idea that her life and his were tied together by a secret buried long ago. And now that the truth had found its way back to him, he knew he could never escape it again. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in his dark study, staring at the old photograph he had secretly taken a picture of before leaving the diner. The image felt heavier than paper. It carried years of guilt, lies, and unfinished stories. His mind kept replaying the look on Emma's face, the innocence in her eyes when she said, "He was betrayed." That one word refused to leave his thoughts. He poured himself a glass of water, but his hands trembled. For so many years, he had believed one version of the truth, that Daniel Brooks, his father's business partner, had stolen money from their company and run away. That story had been told to him over and over until it became fact. But now, after seeing Emma and that photo, he wasn't sure anymore. Deep inside, he felt that something had been terribly wrong all along. He pulled out an old file cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. Dust rose into the air as he flipped through folders labeled with dates and deals from decades ago. Finally, he found a thin folder marked Brooks Case. Inside were documents, partnership papers, financial statements, and one short report with the word fraud stamped across the top. But the handwriting on it wasn't his father's. It belonged to one of the lawyers who had mysteriously disappeared after the scandal. As he read through the papers, his heart started to pound. Some of the numbers didn't make sense. Certain signatures were slightly off. It looked like someone had forged part of the documents to make Daniel appear guilty. Richard leaned back in his chair, feeling a cold wave of realization. What if Daniel had been innocent all along? He remembered the day his father told him Daniel was gone. "Forget him, Richard," his father had said sharply. "He made his choice. He betrayed this family and ruined everything." Richard had been young and too loyal to question it. He had buried the pain, focused on rebuilding the company, and carried the Hale name with pride. But now that pride felt like poison. The next morning, Richard sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline. For the first time, the tall buildings and expensive cars outside didn't make him feel powerful. They only reminded him that his success might have been built on another man's fall. He decided to call an old employee, Mr. Harris, one of the few men who had worked for both Daniel and his father. The man was retired now, living quietly outside the city. When Richard asked if they could meet, there was a long silence on the phone before Harris finally agreed. That afternoon, Richard drove himself to a small, quiet house on the edge of town. The old man greeted him with surprise and a hint of suspicion. "Haven't seen you in years, Mr. Hale," Harris said, his voice rough with age. "Didn't think you'd ever come here." Richard sat across from him and placed the photo on the table. "Do you remember this day?" he asked. Harris adjusted his glasses and stared at the picture. A sad smile touched his lips. "I remember. That was the start of everything. And the end of it too." Richard leaned forward. "Tell me the truth, Harris. What really happened to Daniel Brooks?" The old man's smile faded. He looked away for a long moment, then sighed. "I always thought you should have known," he said softly. "Your father wasn't an evil man, but he was desperate. The company was failing. He needed someone to blame, someone who wouldn't fight back. Daniel trusted him like a brother, and that trust cost him everything." Richard's stomach twisted. "You mean my father framed him?" Harris nodded slowly. "Daniel refused to go along with some of your father's shady deals. He wanted to do business honestly. But when the company's accounts fell short, your father moved the money, then made it look like Daniel had taken it. He told everyone Daniel disappeared with the funds, but that wasn't true. Daniel came to confront him, and that night he vanished. No one saw him again." The words hit Richard like a punch. His father, the man he had admired his whole life, had destroyed his friend's name to save his own legacy. He felt sick. "And his family?" Richard asked weakly. "They lost everything," Harris said. "His wife tried to fight, but no one believed her. People called her husband a thief. She had to sell her house and move away. I heard she raised their little girl alone." Richard closed his eyes. The little girl, that was Emma, the waitress who smiled kindly at him every day, who worked herself to exhaustion to take care of her mother. She had grown up in poverty because of his family's lies. He sat there in silence, unable to speak. When he finally opened his eyes, his expression was hard but broken. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for telling me the truth." That evening, Richard drove aimlessly through the city. The rain started to fall, blurring the lights around him. He thought about Daniel, about how different things could have been. He thought about Emma, working late at that small diner, completely unaware that the man who had walked into her life carried the burden of her father's downfall. He parked his car near the diner but didn't go inside. He just sat there, watching through the window as Emma laughed with a customer. She looked so alive, so full of kindness, the same kindness her father once had. The guilt in Richard's chest grew heavier until it hurt to breathe. He whispered to himself, "I owe her the truth. I owe them both." But he also knew that telling her the truth could destroy everything. His company, his reputation, his father's name. Still, deep inside, he felt that maybe this was his chance to make things right, no matter the cost. As the diner lights dimmed and Emma began cleaning the tables, Richard started the car and drove away, his decision made. He would uncover every document, every piece of evidence that proved Daniel Brooks's innocence. He would find justice for the man who never got it, and for the daughter who had suffered quietly all her life. When he finally reached home, he went straight to his office again. He pulled out old company files, sent emails to lawyers, and began digging through archives. His entire empire had been built on a lie, and he was ready to risk it all to fix it. But as he worked late into the night, he couldn't stop hearing Emma's voice in his mind. Some things are worth more than money, and for the first time in his life, Richard truly understood what that meant. The next morning, Emma woke up early as usual, ready for another long day at the diner. But something about that morning felt different. Maybe it was the way the sunlight entered through the small window of her tiny apartment, Or maybe it was because she still couldn't stop thinking about that rich man, Mr. Hale, and the strange reaction he had when he saw her father's picture. His shocked face kept replaying in her mind, and deep inside, she felt something big was about to happen. Something that could change her life forever. At the same time, miles away in his grand mansion, Richard Hale sat at his desk surrounded by old documents, yellowed papers, and photographs. His eyes were tired, but his determination was strong. He had spent the entire night digging through the company's archives, searching for every bit of evidence that could prove Daniel Brooks's innocence. Each document he found only made him more certain that his father had committed a terrible wrong. He discovered hidden records, secret transfers of money, missing contracts, and signatures that didn't match Daniel's handwriting. The truth was becoming painfully clear. Daniel had never stolen a single cent. It was Richard's father who had betrayed him to save his own reputation and keep the company alive. Richard leaned back in his chair, covering his face with both hands. His father had always been his hero, the man he had looked up to his entire life. Now that image was shattered. All he could see was a man who had destroyed his best friend and left an innocent family to suffer. He couldn't let this continue. He needed to make it right, no matter how painful it would be. Later that afternoon, Richard arrived at the diner again. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside. Emma looked up from behind the counter, surprised to see him there again. "Good afternoon, sir," she greeted politely, though her voice carried a bit of confusion. He wasn't like the usual customers. There was something heavy about him, something sad. "Emma," Richard said softly, walking closer. "Can we talk? It's important." She hesitated for a moment but nodded. "Sure. Give me a minute. I'll ask someone to cover for me." They sat in a quiet corner booth near the window. Richard's eyes were serious, and his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "I need to tell you something about your father, Daniel Brooks," he began. Emma's heart skipped a beat. You knew my father?" Richard nodded slowly. "Yes. A long time ago he worked with my father. They built the company together. He was a good man. Honest, loyal, and kind. But something terrible happened, and your father was blamed for something he didn't do." Emma frowned in confusion. "Blamed? For what?" "For stealing money," Richard replied. "But it was a lie. My father framed him to protect himself and the business. Your father was innocent." For a moment, Emma just stared at him, unable to speak. Her chest tightened, and tears began to fill her eyes. "That can't be true. Everyone said he ran away. They said he was a thief." Richard shook his head, his voice full of regret. "He didn't run. He tried to confront my father that night, and after that, he disappeared. I only recently found the proof. He was betrayed, Emma. And it was my family's fault." Tears rolled down Emma's cheeks. She pressed her hands against her mouth to stop a sob from escaping. All her life, she had grown up believing her father was a criminal. Her mother had cried for years, whispering prayers for people to remember the good man Daniel was. Now, hearing this truth felt like a knife through her heart, and a strange sense of relief at the same time. Richard's voice cracked. "I'm so sorry for what my family did to yours. If I could change the past, I would. But I promise you this. I'll make it right." Emma wiped her tears, trying to stay calm. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked softly. "Because you deserve the truth," he said. "And because I can't live another day knowing that your father's name was destroyed because of us." She stared at him for a long moment. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the guilt weighing heavily on him. Despite her anger and pain, something in her heart told her that he meant every word. After a moment, she whispered, "Thank you for telling me the truth. My mom always said my father wasn't a bad man. No one believed her, not even me sometimes. But she was right." Richard nodded, his eyes glistening. "She was. And I'm going to make sure the world knows it too." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Inside were old papers, financial reports, and photos, all proof that Daniel Brooks had been innocent. "I've already called my lawyers," he continued. "I'm reopening the case. We'll clear your father's name officially." The company will make a public statement, and everything he built will be recognized as his work. Your family will get what was stolen from you. Emma's lips trembled. You don't have to do that. I do, Richard said firmly. It's the least I can do. There was silence between them for a while. The sound of coffee cups clinking and customers chatting softly filled the diner. Finally, Emma spoke again. You know, my father used to tell me that truth always comes out, no matter how deep people try to bury it. She smiled faintly through her tears. I guess he was right. Richard smiled sadly. He was a wise man. They sat there quietly for a few more minutes. For the first time, Emma felt a strange peace. It was painful, yes, but also freeing. Like a wound finally beginning to heal after years of hurting. Before leaving, Richard stood up and said gently, Emma, I'll be in touch soon. There's still a lot to fix, but this time, I'll do it the right way. She nodded. Thank you, Mr. Hale. He paused, looking at her with a soft, almost fatherly expression. Please, call me Richard. That evening, as Emma walked home under the setting sun, she thought about everything that had happened. The truth about her father, the guilt in Richard's eyes, and the years of lies that had finally been broken. She looked up at the sky, whispering, You're finally free, Dad. And somewhere deep inside, she felt he was smiling down on her, proud, at peace, and finally vindicated after all those painful years. Meanwhile, Richard drove home, his heart heavy yet lighter than it had been in decades. For the first time, he felt he was doing something truly meaningful, not for profit or power, but for redemption. Little did they both know, this truth was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change both of their lives forever. The next few days were full of emotions neither Emma nor Richard could truly describe. After their conversation at the diner, everything changed, not just for Emma, but for Richard too. For Emma, it was as if the heavy chain she'd been carrying all her life had finally fallen off. For Richard, it was the beginning of a long journey toward redemption. That evening, Richard stayed awake in his study, preparing documents and calling old contacts. He knew fixing what his father had broken wouldn't be simple. The story was old, the lies were deep, and powerful people were still tied to them. But he didn't care. He was determined to restore Daniel Brooks's name, and to give Emma and her mother the peace they deserved. The next morning, Richard went to his company headquarters. The tall glass building that once made him proud now felt like a monument to guilt. His employees greeted him with their usual respect, but his mind was elsewhere. He went straight into the boardroom where his top executives were waiting. Gentlemen, Richard began, his voice calm but serious, there's something I need to tell you. It's about the foundation of this company, and a man named Daniel Brooks. The executives exchanged confused looks. One of them, Mr. Turner, cleared his throat. Sir, that's decades-old history. Why bring it up now? Because it was built on a lie, Richard said. My father accused Daniel Brooks of theft, but it wasn't true. Daniel was innocent, and our company destroyed his life. I have the evidence to prove it. The room went silent. Some of the men looked stunned, others uneasy. Turner shook his head slowly. Sir, with all due respect, reopening that case could ruin the company's image. Investors might panic. The media. I don't care about the media, Richard interrupted, his tone sharp. This company was built on the suffering of an innocent man. If we lose money for telling the truth, then so be it. I'd rather fall with honesty than rise with deceit. There was a long silence. No one dared to argue further. Richard stood tall, his voice firm but full of emotion. From this day, our company will honor Daniel Brooks as its rightful co-founder. His family will receive everything that was stolen from them, the shares, the compensation, and the recognition he always deserved. Some of the executives nodded quietly, realizing they were witnessing history being rewritten. Later that afternoon, Richard met with a group of journalists. For the first time, he publicly shared the truth. How his father had framed Daniel Brooks, how the evidence was forged, and how Daniel's family had been left in ruin. Cameras flashed, reporters gasped, and the news spread like wildfire. The next morning, Emma woke up to her phone buzzing endlessly. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers were sending her messages. Confused, she opened one of them and froze. There it was, a headline on every news site. Billionaire Richard Hale exposes family secret. Business partner framed decades ago. Waitress's father proven innocent. Her eyes filled with tears as she scrolled through the article. There was even a photo of her father, smiling beside Richard's father in the old days. Below it, a quote from Richard. Daniel Brooks was an honest man. He didn't steal, he was betrayed. The Hale family owes him everything. Emma covered her mouth, sobbing quietly. All the years of pain, the whispers, the judgment, they were finally over. Her father's name was clean again. At that moment, her mother walked into the room, holding a cup of tea. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Emma turned the screen toward her. Her mother squinted, then gasped, covering her lips with trembling hands. Tears rolled down her face as she whispered, "Daniel, they finally know the truth." For the first time in years, there was peace in her mother's eyes. She sat down beside Emma, holding her hand tightly. "Your father always said the truth would come out. He never lost hope, even when the world turned against him." Emma hugged her mother tightly, both of them crying but smiling through their tears. Later that day, Richard personally visited them. He didn't come as a billionaire this time, no expensive car, no bodyguards, no fancy suit. Just a humble man carrying flowers and an envelope. When Emma opened the door, she was surprised. "Mr. Hale." "Richard," he corrected softly, smiling. "May I come in?" Emma nodded and invited him inside. Her mother stood up slowly, still emotional. Richard bowed his head respectfully. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I owe you and your husband an apology, one that's far too late." She shook her head gently. "You didn't do what your father did. You've made it right. That's all that matters now." Richard's eyes glistened. "Still, I can't undo the years of pain, but I can try to make your future a little better." He handed her the envelope. Inside were legal documents transferring a portion of company shares and a large financial settlement, enough to secure their lives forever. Emma's mother's eyes widened. "We can't accept this." "You must," Richard said softly. "It's not a gift. It's what Daniel was owed. This belongs to you." Emma's throat tightened as she whispered, "Thank you for everything." Richard smiled gently. "No, Emma. Thank you. You reminded me what truth and decency look like. Your father would be proud of you." For a moment, none of them spoke. The air was heavy with emotion but full of warmth. After Richard left, Emma stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the street. The sky was bright that day, the kind of brightness that felt like a new beginning. At work the next day, everyone treated Emma differently. Some apologized for the way they had once judged her, while others looked at her with admiration. But Emma didn't feel proud because of the fame or money. She felt proud because her father's honor had finally been restored. Meanwhile, Richard received thousands of messages, some praising his courage, others questioning his decision. But he didn't care what the world thought. For the first time in years, he could look at himself in the mirror without shame. That night, he sat in his office, looking at Daniel's photo. He whispered, "I hope you can forgive us. Your truth finally won." And in that quiet moment, as the city lights glowed outside his window, it felt as if Daniel's spirit was there, watching, smiling, and finally at peace. For both Emma and Richard, the past no longer haunted them. The truth had set them free. And though their lives had been connected by pain and betrayal, now they were joined by something far stronger: justice, forgiveness, and the quiet power of truth. Weeks passed after the truth came out, but for Emma and her mother, life had completely changed. The small apartment that once felt heavy with sadness now felt warm and full of light. Her mother smiled more often, and the dark circles under her eyes slowly faded. It was as if a long nightmare had finally ended. Emma still worked at the diner for a while, not because she needed the money anymore, but because she loved the simplicity of it, the people, the laughter, and the feeling of being useful. But deep down, she knew life was leading her toward something new. One morning, while Emma was serving coffee to her usual customers, the doorbell chimed. When she looked up, she saw Richard Hale standing there. He wasn't in a suit this time, just a simple shirt and coat. He smiled warmly as their eyes met. The other waitresses whispered to each other in surprise, recognizing the famous billionaire sitting in their little diner again. Emma walked over with a shy smile. "Richard, I didn't expect to see you here. I owed someone breakfast," he said with a playful grin. "And I thought maybe this time, I could leave a proper tip." Emma laughed softly and sat across from him for a moment. "You've already given me more than enough. You gave my father back his honor." Richard shook his head. "No, Emma. You gave me something more important. You showed me what real strength looks like." They talked for a long time, about her father, her mother, and how life had changed since the truth came out. Richard listened to her stories with genuine interest, not as a billionaire or a boss, but as a friend. When he finally left, he said, "There's a place for people like you in my company. Honest, hardworking people who never give up. Think about it, Emma. I'd be honored to have you on my team." Emma was speechless. She smiled politely and said she'd think about it, though she wasn't sure she belonged in that world. But Richard wasn't the kind of man who made empty offers. A few days later, she received a letter on official company paper. It was a job offer, a position in the company's charity foundation. The letter said she would help manage community programs that supported struggling families, single mothers, and children in need. When she showed it to her mother's eyes filled with tears. "Your father would be so proud of you," she whispered. Emma accepted the job. Her first day at the office was nothing like she expected. She thought people might look down on her because of her background, but instead, everyone treated her with kindness. Many already knew her story, how the truth about her father had changed everything, and they respected her even more for it. Working there wasn't easy. There were long hours, tough meetings, and emotional stories from people in need. But Emma poured her heart into it. Every time she helped a struggling family, she felt closer to her father. It was as if she was continuing the good he had always tried to do. Richard often stopped by her office to check in. He never treated her like an employee, more like a friend, or perhaps even a daughter he'd never had. Over time, their bond grew deeper. They would talk about life, loss, and how one truth had changed both of them forever. One evening, after a long charity event, Richard invited Emma and her mother to a private dinner. It was held at the company's headquarters, in a grand hall filled with portraits of past founders. For years, those portraits had only shown one man, Richard's father. But that night, there was a new portrait unveiled beside it, Daniel Brooks. The room fell silent as the cover was lifted. Emma gasped when she saw her father's smiling face, painted beautifully and placed with honor beside the man who had once betrayed him. Beneath the portrait, a golden plaque read, "Daniel Brooks, co-founder and the heart of Hale Industries. A man of honesty, courage, and vision." Tears streamed down Emma's cheeks as everyone applauded. Richard stood beside her, his voice steady and full of pride. "For too long, this company carried a lie," he said. "But tonight we correct that. Daniel Brooks was the soul of this business, a man whose honesty built the foundation we stand on. His truth will live here forever." Emma couldn't stop crying. She turned to Richard and whispered, "Thank you for giving him back to us." Richard smiled softly. "No, Emma. Thank you for giving me the courage to face my past." That night, as they drove home, Emma looked out the car window at the city lights. She felt her father's presence beside her, not as a painful memory, but as a proud, comforting spirit. She whispered to herself, "We did it, Dad. You're finally where you belong." In the months that followed, Emma flourished in her new role. She led several community projects and even started a scholarship program in her father's name for students who came from poor families. Every time she saw someone's life change for the better, she smiled, remembering the waitress she once was, tired, struggling, but never giving up. Richard, too, changed. The cold, serious businessman everyone once feared became known for his kindness and humility. He often told his story publicly, warning others about the price of greed and the power of truth. Years later, when people spoke about the Hale Corporation, they no longer mentioned only wealth and power. They spoke of honesty, redemption, and a young waitress who helped a billionaire rediscover his humanity.